Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. And thanks for coming tonight for a discussion of the new book by Larry Rohter, Into the Amazon, The Life of Candido Rondon, trailblazing explorer, scientist, statesman, and conservationist. The New York Times wrote of the book last year, Into the Amazon is important reading. We tend to excuse historical figures' rotten behavior by contextualizing their beliefs within the era in which they lived. But in fact, every age has a full component of attitudes, from narrow-minded prejudice to utopian idealism. For that reason alone, Rohter's crisp biography is a welcome addition to the new, more inclusive canon. Larry Rohter will be joined tonight by NYU historian Barbara Weinstein. My name is Salvatore Scabona, the Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library, where you find yourself right now. As some of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to our collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the very best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999. We're currently hosting our 26th annual class of fellows. This series of conversations presents the books that they came to the Cullman Center to write. If you or anyone else is interested in applying, you may do that through the Cullman Center's website through 5 p.m. on September 27th. Mark your calendars. Tonight, Larry and Barbara will talk together for about 35 to 40 minutes. Then they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will walk along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Copies of Into the Amazon are for sale in the hall, and Larry has agreed to sign your copy for you after the talk. He will be talking about the book with Barbara Weinstein, who is Silver Professor of History at NYU and former president of the American Historical Association. Her publications include The Amazon Rubber Boom, 1850 to 1920, For Social Peace in Brazil, Industrialists and the Remaking of the Working Class in Sao Paulo, 1920 to 1964, and The Color of Modernity, Sao Paulo and the Making of Race and Nation in Brazil. Her research has received funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Fulbright Hayes, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute. In 2017 and 18, my first year as Cullman Center Director, she was the Joanna Jackson Goldman Fellow at the Cullman Center, where she began research for an intellectual biography of the pioneering Latin Americanist and criminologist Frank Tannenbaum. Larry Rohter was the Rio de Janeiro bureau chief of the New York Times from 1998 to 2008 and held the same role at Newsweek from 1977 to 1982. He's the author of 2 previous books about Brazil, one in Portuguese and one in English. He worked on his biography of Rondon during his Cullman Center Fellowship in 2015 to 2016. Please help me welcome Larry Rohter and Barbara Weinstein.
So Larry, I want to start by saying how much I enjoyed reading this book.
Music to my ears.
All right. As Salvatore mentioned, I am working on a biography, and I have been reading biographies to sort of get my mind wrapped around my own biographical project. And I find sometimes that there's just too much detail, not clear enough where the biographer is going. And I found that Into the Amazon was, if anything, I wanted to know even more about Rondon by the end of the biography. And I felt it was very clear where you were going with it. But maybe you could start by sharing with us Uh, what attracted you to this project? You know, I have to say that when I found out you had written a biography of Rondon, it wasn't something I would have immediately predicted. So what attracted you to this project? Why a book about Rondon? Why did you feel he was worthy of a 400-page biography?
Sure. First of all, though, I want to say how happy I am to be back at the Cullman Center. That was a great year that I spent here. And it was a year really where this project came together and made the jump from something in my head into something that was on paper, something real. And also, Barbara, thanks for doing this. And I should mention to the audience that the book that Salvatore mentioned, Barbara's first book on the Amazon rubber boom, was really helpful to me in describing the world and the time in which Rondon was operating. So it was a great help when I was getting going. Now, as to the question, I first traveled to the Amazon in 1978 on a reporting trip for Newsweek. And the place I went was in the western Amazon, the territory of Rondonia, named for Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon. And I was a young guy. I was in pretty good shape, but it was hard. It was hot. The insects were biting all the time. There were lots of diseases. The roads that's, in quotations, the roads that I was traveling on were what was left of the telegraph lines that Rondon had constructed 75 years earlier. And so day after day, I was saying to myself, God, who was this guy? He must have been tough as nails. Because I'm thinking, he was here 75 years before I am. Imagine what the conditions must have been like then. And yet he came back year after year after year on these expeditions. What kind of person must he have been? And so when I got back to Rio, I started collecting string, getting all the information I could on this guy. And the more I learned, the more interesting he seemed. Oh, he's of indigenous descent. Oh, he's a little guy who's 5'2", barely weighed 110 pounds. He wasn't anything like the stereotype we have of, a Western explorer. Everything about him was different. And I started saying to my friends and my wife's family, I think I should write a biography of Rondon. And they, yeah. And it kept, getting put back. And, life, you got to write news stories, and you have kids, and et cetera. And I kept saying I was going to do it. And then in 2010, two things happened. First, the New York Times, where I was employed, published a review of the third volume of Edmund Morris's biography of Teddy Roosevelt, Colonel Roosevelt. And there's a picture, and it's from the expedition that Rondon and Roosevelt made together in 1913, 1914. But there's no mention of Rondon in the caption. And I was thinking to myself, well, it's right, but it's not right. Roosevelt was tagging along essentially on one of Rondon's many expeditions, but Rondon is always relegated to second place, secondary role. Really, I've got to write this book, and it should be the next book that I do. And then that was maybe Thanksgiving of 2010, and at Christmas, my wife's cousin, who had been listening to me say for years I was going to do this book, he gave me Rondon's memoirs as a Christmas present. And so I said, okay, message received. That's what finally pushed me into doing this. It had always been there in the back of my mind. He didn't lose meaning or relevance as the years went on. I think he gained them. And when I got the chance, I went for it. And this is the result.
Thank you. So there are several features of Rondon's life that you develop in the book that I think were especially interesting to me. Now, I will say, at the risk of, I've probably put several generations of undergraduates to sleep talking about positivism in Brazil. So, but I continue to think positivism is both very interesting and sometimes bizarre. And Rondon was not only a lifelong positivist, and since he died at 93, lifelong is a long time, but he was a really orthodox positivist. Lots of Brazilians of his generation were influenced by positivism, but he took it very, very sort of seriously
Absolutely.
and literally. And this is particularly interesting to me because positivism is generally not seen as a particularly democratic ideology. It's the rule of experts, it's scientific knowledge, so on. So if you could talk about, what function, in a sense, did positivism have for Rondon in his long life?
I think it's the single most important intellectual influence in his life. He really did go for it hook, line, and sinker. And, it is a strange mixture of philosophy and religion. I'm going to use a kind of a flippant one-sentence phrase to describe it. It's kind of like Catholicism with scientists as saints. It really emphasizes science and logic, but puts it in a religious framework. And it's French in origin, Auguste Comte, 19th century. And it was meant to be an antidote to emerging socialism. It was supposed to be evolutionary instead of revolutionary. And it took hold in Brazil, and many people of Rondon's generation went for it. But he's one of the few who died a positivist. His last words are he's reciting the positivist credo. And, it's funny because my wife's reaction is much like the one you're talking about. I would tell her at breakfast and lunch, what I had written and what I had just read about Rondon and positivism, and she would kind of groan. And she would say to me, how could a man who was so intelligent and so learned fall for such claptrap? And it's a good question, and I don't have an answer. I think the evolutionary versus revolutionary aspect of it appealed to him. He was trained as an astronomist and a military engineer, so the emphasis on science above all else appealed to him as well. And then this is one of the good features of positivism. There's this phrase that comes from Comte, and Rondon would write it all the time in his diary as a kind of a jog, a memory jog. Viver para outrem, to live for others. Comte invented the word altruism. And hardcore positivists believed sincerely in altruism and sacrificing individual goals and aspirations for the greater good. And that, I think, was one of the main motors for Rondon. It's something he deeply believed in. He castigated himself when he fell short, but it was, as I said in the start of this answer, it was the most important influence in his life and a belief system that molded and ordered his life.
I very much agree with it. That kind of orthodox positivism, it's always hard for me to imagine someone as, sort of as rational as
an
Rondon
intellectual.
and intellectual.
Yeah.
But it's kind of fascinating. I wonder if you think, he's from such a modest background. I mean, he's not from an impoverished background. His family had some standing in the
one side of it.
region.
Yeah.
But he's from definitely not from a privileged background, and I wonder if he needed something like that, because he's starting to circulate in the circles of power and influence in Brazil from a I don't want to say underprivileged, but much less privileged background than most of his
Peers.
Peers.
Yeah, I mean, he grew up in the backlands. He grew up in the state of Mato Grosso, and in a place where pretty much his destiny would have been, he would have been a cowboy, herding cattle and farming. But he showed intellectual promise, and so he went to the state capital where they thought, oh, okay, he'll be a normal school teacher. But he wanted more, and that's when he went to Rio, and that's really where he changed. He was exposed to all these intellectual movements and political movements, the final years of empire, the last years of slavery, the heyday of positivism. It was the hot intellectual idea among scientists and military officers at the time. And the people he admired believed in it, and I think he followed in their track. And if I can get a little Freudian here, his father died before he was born. And you can see in Rondon's childhood and youth a search for father figures. And when he went to the military academy, he really fell under the intellectual spell of Benjamin Constant, who was the prime advocate of positivism in Brazil. And Benjamin Constant became a father figure to him. He named his son Benjamin. He named a daughter after Benjamin Constant's daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He became the executor of Benjamin Constant's will. So he found a home intellectually and otherwise in positivism. That makes sense, I think, no?
It makes sense, yeah. So one aspect that I've found fascinating, there are many things. I mean, Rondon's whole life is incredibly interesting to me, but the positivism, certainly very interesting to me. And then the other is the question of his identity as an indigenous person. I mean, his mother, I gather, was either entirely or mainly Bororo, was she?
Yeah, well, and that there's some Terena, and then on his father's side, he's got some Guaná. But I would say, I tried to trace his family back as far as I could, and of his great-grandparents, 10 are indigenous, 5 are white, and 1 is black. So, but he grew up, so his father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 2. He's raised by a grandfather and his godmother. And so there are Bororo and Terena background. So he grew up in that kind of environment, had some of the language, but then perfected it later. And in a way, I don't think he had a choice, because even now, when I show people Brazilians pictures of Rondon, they say, ele tem cara de índio. Yeah, he has an Indian face. And he does have, I think, indigenous features. And he was therefore put into that category.
But there is that one, episode where he's giving a speech and he says, "If I had been a white man," and there's I think a journalist
Yeah.
who's there who says,
Wait a
"Are
minute.
you wait?
What-
I mean,
what-
are
what?
you
You're not
saying
white?"
you're not white?"
No.
And I don't think the journalist was either being coy or deceptive. I think because in Brazil, someone like Rondon, who circulated in arenas of whiteness,
Yeah.
that in effect his not. I guess my question is about how much does his indigenous descent matter in terms of his life, given that he was engaged with a world that was people of power and generally white or whitish.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he definitely had an affinity for indigenous people, and in his heart cared more about their well-being than anybody else's. But he was clearly, if I can use a term from another country, I mean, from South Africa, you would say he was an honorary white, and was treated as white. And when I was looking into his personal life, he married a white woman, and there doesn't seem to have been any opposition in her family to her marrying this indigenous guy. In 1892 is the year they married. Of course, her father had been one of his teachers in school, and was one of the people who saw just how brilliant this young guy was. So that may have overcome any, resistance or concern about, oh, he's not really white. But, he did become a national hero, and there were people who didn't like him, and they made fun of him for being mixed race. And, there's a word in Portuguese, caboclo, that's it's a word that means a lot of different things depending on the context. But in this context, it was being used, they would call him nosso caboclo, nosso soldado caboclo, our hillbilly soldier, is the way I guess I would translate it in that context. But our mixed race soldier. And there were jibes like that too. Yeah. And late in life, I think he just said, yeah, well, I'm an Indian.
Yeah. Interesting. So,
one last thing, I'm sorry, that's relevant. When Getulio Vargas came to power in 1930, Rondon was in political disfavor, but it's interesting to look at the newsreels from that time and see the use that they made of him as the model of the new Brazilian man.
Yeah, you mentioned at one point you said he was the poster boy
Yeah,
for
yeah.
the sort of emerging idea of Brazil as a racial democracy.
Absolutely. And my mother-in-law was a child in those days, and she remembers going to the movies, in Rio, and seeing these newsreels in which they exalt Rondon as this mixture of the three races that make up our nation, white, indigenous, and black. So there's an interesting contradiction there, because they had no use for him politically. He was politically suspect, but as a racial type, he was like a bonanza for them.
Right, because he could be a Brazilian hero,
Right,
and yet not be a white man.
And the idea, it's the exact opposite of what we have in the American South at the time, or even in the North. Miscegenation as a defining feature of national identity, and one to be proud of. And he really is kind of the first example of the new Brazilian man.
Yeah. Yeah, so despite his not having a good relationship with Vargas at all.
Right,
he's,
right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I'm going to shift a little and ask you about the sources that you used for the book. I mean, this is a biography. I think all biographies are works of history, but this is really a work of history.
Yeah.
In part because he had such a long life, and you cover such a large portion of Brazil's post-independence history in the book, and so this is kind of a long question, but I'll get to my point. That I'm working on this biography of someone who really never kept a diary, in one very brief travel diary, whereas you have a really long, you have 79 volumes extending from 1892 to 1954 of Rondon's almost daily thoughts and accounts. And so on the one hand, I feel really envious that you have all this diary.
Everybody says that to me.
So,
yeah.
But I just want to read this quote that Thomas Mallon has in A Book of One's Own, People and Their Diaries, and it's a terrific quote from Nicholas Nickleby. Some of the craftiest scoundrels that ever walked this earth will gravely jot down in diaries the events of every day and keep a regular debtor and creditor account with heaven, which shall always show a floating balance in their own favor. So, and so my question now, Rondon was definitely not a scoundrel, so, but still, I wonder to what extent having so much autobiographical material is a mixed blessing. Did you ever feel like Rondon's self-presentation conflicted with your sense of what he was doing or who he was?
Well, not often, occasionally, but because he wants to be the perfect positivist and live up to everything he believes in, he castigates himself when he falls short. And I don't think that's for show. I think that's for real. And I've got to say that, finding those diaries was a real turning point. When I was here, I had a picture of Rondon on the bulletin board behind me, just as a kind of an inspiration. And I had his military logbook, his service jacket. And so I knew everything he had done between 1890 and 1930, or no, 1882 and 1930, his whole military career. Every time he had been assigned to go someplace or do something, it was there. But I got to the point where I look at that picture and I would say to myself, I don't know who he is. And that's a problem. I know what he did, but I don't know who he is. And then I was in Rio, and I was working at Fort Copacabana, where there's a lot of military archives. And one of the military officers just said to me kind of casually one day, we have a lot of Rondon's field books, logs, and diaries. Would you like to see them? He said, they're back in a corner. It takes some doing to go get them, but, are you interested? And I said, yes. And that was a decisive moment, because once I had those diaries in hand, I could, they're funny diaries because he's reflecting on what he's doing. He's reflecting on his work. He's reflecting on what he's thinking. He's reflecting on what he's reading. He's reflecting on what he's feeling about his missing his wife in the field and his children. So they're unusual diaries maybe in that way, because they're multifunctional. And I know that I should be satisfied with that gold that I found, but there are other things that I couldn't get at that frustrated me. For example, his personal library, when he died, it was given to the military, and it was just distributed to bases all around the country. So there's no way to see what books he read and what he wrote in the margins. And his letters the letters between him and his wife were lost during World War I. She went with their kids to spend the war years. Well, they were going to get a French education, and she went with them there, and he was off in the jungle, and the letters were lost, so there's no way to see those. And then the kind of neatest thing of all, and there's no way to have a record of this, he taught his wife Morse code so that when he was off in the jungle at a telegraph post, at the end of the day, they could get on the telegraph line and talk to each other. Really quite lovely. But there's
an early version of Zoom.
Yeah, an early version of Zoom. But there's no record. How can there be? There is no record. So it's frustrating not to have access to that, what I would assume be the most intimate exchange between husband and wife. So.
Okay, so I think this might be we have about 5 more minutes, okay. So I wanted to ask you about what I see as a certain tension, both in his life and in the book, between Rondon's extreme quote-unquote pacifism and his career as a military man. I mean, he spent his whole life as a military man. Because of the dictatorship, the military dictatorship from 64 to 85, and then Bolsonaro's relationship with the military, I think most scholars and writers have a kind of unsavory image of the Brazilian armed forces. So, what sense do you get of how did writing about Rondon's career in the Brazilian military, and the Brazilian military as an institution that has a space for him, how did that affect your sense of the history of the Brazilian military?
Okay, there's a micro answer to that and a macro, so let me do them both. The micro answer is really not that complicated. I came to this project with a lot of baggage, you might say, because I had 30 years as a journalist writing about human rights abuses by the military, military boondoggles on development projects, et cetera, et cetera. And I was kind of concerned of, how are they going to react? Because they control the spigot. To my surprise, I was quite warmly welcomed, and got to know a goodly number of military officers, and was able to talk with them frankly about these issues of the Brazilian history, of the Brazilian military's role in history. They put me at ease by saying, look, we know who you are, but if you're a friend of Rondon, then you're a friend of ours. It's a very Brazilian kind of attitude. So the macro part of that is, I wrote this book at a time when the Workers' Party was in power. And then comes the 2018 election. Bolsonaro is sworn in January 1st, 2019. My book comes out in Brazil April or May of that year. And it immediately gets drawn into the political moment, because I was doing a book tour and everybody always said, well, what about Bolsonaro and Rondon? And, and I would have to say, look, Bolsonaro is Rondon in reverse. He represents everything that Rondon is not, and is the antithesis of everything that Rondon values. Rondon's attitude about indigenous policy was, we let every tribal people decide for themselves what kind of relationship they want, if any, with our society. If they don't want any, that's fine, and it's still our duty to protect them from the worst elements of our society, from the rubber tappers, the miners, the timber merchants, and the ranchers. Bolsonaro's attitude was Indians need to assimilate now, and if they don't like it, it's too bad. And besides, you know, the American cavalry did a much better job than ours did. I mean, he said that. And that was a direct slap at Rondon, because Rondon's a pacifist. But also, the Amazon, Rondon's is, you know, it has to be development that's sustainable and rational and limited. And, you know, Bolsonaro is, let's get in there tomorrow and, you know, no more land for the Indians and let's have mines. So it's the complete antithesis. But what I found was that some of the military officers I got to know, especially the younger ones, they were aware that their institution had been discredited by the dictatorship of 64 to 85, and they knew that there had been this 30-year effort to rebuild the credibility of the Brazilian military. And to the point where, you know, polls were showing that people had a higher opinion of the military than a lot of other institutions. And so they would say to me, we're not going to throw that away for an adventure with Captain Bolsonaro. And of course, calling him Captain Bolsonaro was a way of pointing out that he had a failed military career. He couldn't get past captain. He was so indisciplined and so, you know, inept. I mean, he wasn't a true leader. That he had to go out. So it was interesting to see the way in 2019 the book was playing, and the way that the attitudes I was seeing among the military, so that when their January 6th came last year, on January 8th, you see that the military, some officers joined Bolsonaro in his attempt to have an auto coup. But the institution as a whole held. They had their doubts about Lula, but the institution held in a way that it didn't in 1889 or 1930 or 1964. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
but
it went beyond really the terms of my question, but it was connected, all connected to my question. And so I would say, sort of summing up, that your sense of the Brazilian military as a result of doing this book was actually somewhat enhanced by
yeah, I mean, there's still elements there that want to do things the old way. But there are, you know, I think especially some of the younger officers. And I'm told that the Brazilian version of this book is now required reading in the military academy. So that's a very encouraging sign, because
absolutely.
I mean, you know, Rondon was a pacifist. He suffered for it because he didn't get promotions as fast as some of his classmates. But in the end, he's this national hero in a way that others were not.
He has a state named after him.
He's the only Brazilian with a state named after him. Yeah.
All right. So I think we'll now move to the questions.
Okay.
Just
Great.
before, I just want to say one more thing about the book and my response to the book. I think a lot of people are very engaged by sort of stories of exploration and hardship in Antarctica and the rainforest, etc. But I've never read anything that gave me such a really not a fanciful, but a very realistic sense, but also incredibly dramatic sense of what it meant to do the kinds of expeditions that Rondon did in parts of the Amazon that were, there are no roads, there are no rivers that no,
No maps.
non-indigenous person has
Yeah.
gone down. So, and the number of canoes he lost and cows that drowned, and but it's really quite amazing. And so I was interested in it both as a work of history, but also as a kind of adventure story.
Sure.
That is.
Yeah, I mean, it was written in part to be an adventure story, but I didn't want to romanticize it.
Yeah,
I didn't want to make it into a movie.
You succeeded in not romanticizing.
Right. I mean, I wanted, having had just a taste of that myself, it's like, I want the reader to feel those bugs biting and what it feels like to have malaria or leishmaniasis or, any of the other, litany of problems that you encounter when you're in the Amazon. So thank you for that.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome. Okay, so let me read. Now I take my glasses off since I had to look near. So first question, how did Rondon's work as a conservationist manifest? Was it part of his protection of indigenous people or about the environment itself?
Both. He, growing up among Indians, and then spending a good chunk of his career with them, he came to see them as natural stewards of the rainforest, or as the phrase he used was sentinels of the rainforest. But also, the only time I ever saw him really move to poetry in his writing was when he's writing about nature. He himself felt exalted by the beauty and majesty and monstrosity of nature. And so that, I think, also impelled him. If we want to look at a concrete example of what he did, he started really in the 1920s when he could see that the encroachment on this world that he had opened. Maybe a bit of a guilt trip, I don't know. But the older he got, the more dedicated he was to the cause of conservationism. We can't say environmentalism because it's pre-environmentalism, really. But I think his main legacy in that regard, combines the two, and that's the Xingu National Park. If you look at the satellite images of the Amazon these days, you'll see this one green swath surrounded by all the land that's been denuded. And that's the Xingu National Park, which is run by a half dozen different indigenous peoples. So yeah, that long answer. Short answer is both.
Both. Yes. Okay, so what do we know of Rondon's descendants today, and how did they receive the Brazilian edition of your book?
Very interesting. Yeah, we're now, some of his grandchildren are still alive, and I talked with them. And, they talked about Sunday lunch at Grandpa's house and how, kind and gentle he was, and, a grandfather figure. But we're now down to his great-grandchildren, and some of them came to events that I did in Rio. And the family was skeptical, I think, at first, because I'm not a Brazilian, I'm an American, and but when the book came out, I think they were quite happy with it, and they went in the press and said so, and they came to events, and we had good conversations. So, and the great-grandchildren said, oh, you got stories there that I've never heard.
Yeah,
And one of them said to me, and I like this, maybe the greatest compliment I got, which is why I remember it, you put flesh on his bones, from one of the great-grandsons. And I said, thank you very much. So Yeah.
No. Hey, let me just inject that, some other people who have written about the history, particularly of certain regions of Brazil and the indigenous peoples, have had less pleasant receptions from their descendants. So like Seth Garfield's indigenous struggle at the heart of Brazil actually got a suit was brought against him because he talked about an indigenous chief who kind of negotiated with the Vargas regime over the position of his people, his community, and this chief's granddaughter felt that because he didn't simply represent him as resisting, the government, that he was besmirching her, her grandfather's, image, reputation. So, it can be,
Either way.
I'm very glad to hear that the reception was warm, but, people often build up such a heroic image of the patriarch of their family.
It's interesting because I think that when you look in a granular way at the relationship between indigenous peoples and the Brazilian state, that indigenous peoples have, there's the Brazilian term ginga, right? They know how to maneuver, they know how to negotiate, they know how to play sides against each other. They're smart, they're canny, and they know they're clearly at a disadvantage, but they know how to play a certain game of politics. And some of it is resistance.
They know how to be political.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they know how to play their own politics, and they know how to play the white man's politics. So good for them.
Yeah. Okay, so let me see. So what motivated him to focus on the Amazon, and how was he able to finance his explorations?
Well, he's born, the place he's born is at either, you can call it the very southern tip of the Amazon or the very northern end of the Pantanal. So it's both of those worlds. So he grew up in an Amazonian environment. And unlike other explorers who saw the Amazon as this exotic place, to him it was a real place with real people, a lot like him. So I'm happy to say that his scientific work, you don't see any of that exoticism or racism that you see in the work of people like Agassiz, for example. Agassiz is probably the worst example.
I mean, you can move up, considerably up the ladder of,
Yes.
of racism.
But Agassiz is the
with
worst.
that and still have a lot of exoticism.
And as far as the financing goes, he was a functionary. He was an employee of the Brazilian state for all those years, and so it was the Brazilian government that financed everything he did, and often he had to fight for it, and often they didn't want to come up with the money he thought he needed, including on the expedition with Roosevelt.
Your discussions of that are very interesting.
It's funny.
The various
It's really
times
funny.
he's, suddenly finding himself getting stuck with the bill for, hundreds of dollars, hundreds of, mil-réis and thousands of mil-réis.
Yeah.
And, someone asks more about the Roosevelt expedition on the River of Doubt, and also, why was your mother in Rio? I think it was your mother-in-law.
My mother-in-law, yeah.
Who was Brazilian.
Right, yeah, my mother-in-law is Brazilian.
That's an easy question.
Yeah.
So, and why was he nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, he was nominated 3 times for a Nobel Peace Prize. The first time was by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein came to Brazil in 1923 or 4, and he got acquainted with Rondon's scientific work and his military work, and it just blew his mind. A pacifist general? His slogan is "Die if you must, but never kill." how is this possible? And so Einstein, on his way back to Europe, wrote a letter to the Norwegians saying, I found this guy who deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. He's been doing all this work for decades, and we in Europe are not really aware of it. But he got passed over, and then he's nominated again in the late 40s by an American who had been following his career for 30 years, and then again in 1956, 2 years before he died. But always for the same thing, for his work in conciliating the indigenous way of life and Western civilization, and doing so in an absolutely nonviolent way. He didn't allow his men to shoot in the, it's all in the book, but he was really, really deep down a pacifist. And there were times when he was threatened and he took the arrow rather than shoot back at somebody. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. So that's why he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 different times.
So I think, do we have time for one more question? Okay. So were Rondon's loyalties nationalist or regionalist? Could you say more about his conflict with Vargas?
Sure. His loyalties were nationalist. He's really a Brazilian patriot. And, reading his diaries, if he's in the far south, if he's in Rio Grande do Sul, he's just as ecstatic as he is when he's in the Amazon. And his one time up in the northeast of Brazil, he was enchanted by that. He loved his country. I mean, it's really old-fashioned, but he was a Brazilian patriot. He really loved his country, his language, his culture. He was proud to be a Brazilian. He's a real 19th century patriot that way. What was the other part?
And can you say more about his conflict with Vargas?
Yeah, they were like oil and water. I mean, they just did not get along. Rondon did not like military coups. Even though he took part in one in 1889, and his attitude was, I'm not going to be a part of this. Everybody around him made their peace with Vargas, but Rondon just wouldn't do it. And so they kind of sent him off to exile for 4 years on a diplomatic mission. And then when he came back, it was the Estado Novo, the worst, the really dictatorial phase. And he played a really complicated political game where he was dealing with Indian affairs, but at the same time, you see he's trying to undermine Vargas's policies in other areas. Vargas wanted to sign a concordat with the Vatican, and Rondon just hated the Catholic Church. He was strongly anti-clerical. And so he really there's a subterranean campaign to wreck any chance for a concordat. And then when Vargas is flirting with Mussolini and Hitler, Rondon, being a Francophile, he's really, really opposed to that as well, and organizing as much as he can without being cast out again, opposition to any kind of alliance, formal or informal, with the Axis. So they just didn't get along from the very beginning.
Yeah. So I think we didn't talk more about the Roosevelt expedition, but I just want to say quickly that for me, one of the things I really appreciated about the book is that while there's a significant chunk of it that deals with the Roosevelt expedition, it's only one episode in Rondon's extremely interesting long life,
Right, and that's-
rather than being the spotlight.
Sure, that's deliberate. I mean, there are several excellent books on the Roosevelt-Rondon expedition, in which Rondon plays a secondary role. And I wanted to write a book in which the expedition would be part of the story, but told from Rondon's point of view, drawing on his diaries and those of the other Brazilians, and have Roosevelt more of the secondary figure, for a change of pace.
Absolutely.
And also to reflect
Oh,
what
and also, I think it was justice.
yeah, I mean, it was Rondon's expedition, and
Yeah,
Kermit Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt tagged along.
Sure, absolutely.
So,
All right, well, thank you very much,
My
Larry.
pleasure.
And
thank you all. Thank you.
if you would like your own copy of this book,
I think we're now in it's
Okay,
paperback, right?
then,
Outside,
yes.
yeah.
Okay, not even a paperback. There are books outside in the hallway, and Larry will be available to sign them.
You bet.